Hi, and welcome to London Lights. Today, I'm very pleased to have as our guest on the program, Ian Brodie, former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Stephen Harper for over 2 years. Ian, welcome to the program.
Dan, I'm glad to be here. I've been looking forward to it for weeks.
Oh, great. Well, it's a pleasure having you. Let me just introduce you to our viewers by reading your short bio that I have here. So Ian Ross Brodie was born in 1967, a centennial baby.
That's right.
How appropriate. And he is a Canadian political scientist and was Chief of Staff in Stephen Harper's Prime Minister's office from Harper's ascension to the position of Prime Minister until July 1st, 2008. Ian attended high school at the University of Toronto. He earned a BA in political science from McGill University in Montreal and an MA and PhD from the University of Calgary. In 1997, he became an assistant professor of political science at the University of Western Ontario in London, promoted to tenured associate professor in 2002. At Western, he specialized in Canadian politics, particularly Canadian conservative politics and law and politics. Currently a professor of poli-sci at the University of Calgary. Ian, welcome again.
Great to be here.
Did I miss anything?
No, I think that's the highs. I mean, except that Dan and I were involved in some political work in London a few years ago now.
Right.
While I was at Western, we had some local shenanigans to do.
Well, we'll talk about that. But I just wanted to let you know, I couldn't get the former Prime Minister here today. So I decided to go for the number 2 man in power during the Harper years. And it's quite a story, I'm sure, and I'm anxious to hear more about it.
Well, I first met Mr. Harper when I was out here doing my master's degree. He was a student in the economics department, and I was in political science. But by that point, he was already working for Preston Manning and the Reform Party at that point. So that would have been before the Reform Party MPs got elected, before I guess Deb Gray had been elected at that point. But the big 1993 turnover election was still in the future. He'd come, Mr. Manning had come to the political science department for a little seminar session about the election to come. And Mr. Harper was there. I'd kept in touch with him over the course of the years. And then when I was in London, worked on his leadership campaign when he won the leadership of the Canadian Alliance. I have to say, it was my wife at the time who got hired into his office. She was an event planner, and the office needed an event planner. And they agreed to hire me. Remember, the Chief of Staff at the time said, "We'll find something for you to do, Ian. You can write some speeches or something like that." And that's how I ended up in Ottawa in 2003.
Well, before we get into that, let's back up a little bit. So is it fair that I refer to you as a Londoner? Did you grow up in London? What were your roots here?
No, I have to say I was fortunate to start my career in London and to really get the sort of solid political science career under me. But I grew up in a little town down the 401, Toronto, and then spent some time in Montreal. But when I finished my PhD in 1997, there were very few jobs available for political science graduates at that point. It was an extremely difficult job market. Western was hiring, and really it was sort of a dream job. I could move back to be close to family and in a really, not just a solid political science department, a good political science department at the time, but such a great university with such close connections to the city. So I was met my wife, got married in Grand Bend, and spent 6 happy years in London.
How do you rise from being in a university? You're a professor there. You've made these contacts with Mr. Harper and with Preston Manning, and now your wife gets hired. What's the next step that brings you closer and you I guess get the confidence of the man that was to become Prime Minister?
When I first arrived in Ottawa in 2003, there was no Conservative Party at the time. Recall there was still a PC Party and a Canadian Alliance. There was, I think, a very decisive by-election going on in Perth, Middlesex, so just outside of London. I'd done some work in that by-election for Marion Minen, who was the Canadian Alliance candidate, but the PC Party ended up winning that by-election. So when I got to Ottawa, in 2003. The by-election was just wrapping up at that point. There was sort of a premium on people who knew something about the London area, and having just come from, I was sort of man on the seat. There were some issues inside the office I had a chance to work on as a management task, but almost as soon as that by-election was over, the movement to create the Conservative Party out of a merger of the PC Party and the Canadian Alliance really got underway. And I have to say it was my involvement in that, and then in Mr. Harper's leadership campaign for the combined party, that really put me on a path of promotion. After he won the leadership of the party, I became executive director of the Conservative Party and really sort of set up the national office and the national organization, and worked on the 2004 election campaign. And then in the summer of 2005, there was a vacancy. He needed someone to run the office back on Parliament Hill and to write the election platform that became the 2006 election platform. And that's how I moved back to Parliament Hill. I traveled during the 2006 election with Mr. Harper. Recall it was an election over Christmas. So it started in November and ran through until the third week of January. So it was an exhausting but fantastic experience to see the country from coast to coast, hopping across in these short little campaign stops across the country. And I sort of had a good sense by Christmas that we were on track to win that campaign. And we did, minority government, but there was all hands on deck when you win. You need every bit of talent that you've developed in opposition to go over to government with you. And that's how I ended up in the Prime Minister's office.
You're a chief of staff for him, correct?
Right.
Now, the average person may not know what a chief of staff is. We hear the word bandied about, but can you describe the position and what it entails?
So there's really three pieces of it. It's the chief political aide to the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister also has a whole civil service of permanent civil servants, at that time, 250,000 people working for him, of permanent civil servants for the government, and then a group of political aides. So as chief of staff, I had to run the Prime Minister's office. We ran, the tour operations to move him around, speeches, policy making, communications work, and so forth. That was a total staff of about 85 people who worked full time for him, just making sure we took care of his needs as the leader. Then I provide oversight of all of the ministers' offices. So each minister had their own office, and dealing with all of the ministers and MPs to make sure that cabinet was working, the government was working properly. And then trying to provide some advice on where the government should go politically, understanding the government has to run, the day-to-day policy affairs of the government. Obviously, that's a huge amount of work, but also you're in government in order to do things. And I think I had an understanding of how Mr. Harper wanted government business done. And, there's only 8 or 12 hours in the day for the Prime Minister. Other people have to step up to kind of make sure he's dealing only with the most important issues in the country, or most important issues in the government. And so it's my third job was to make sure that things that could be settled elsewhere got settled elsewhere, and only things that could be settled at the Prime Minister's level got up to him.
Well, it sounds like you'd be juggling 10 balls at a time. I mean, each and every day must have been quite a challenge.
They were busy days. I started at 7. Mr. Harper would come in at about 8:30 in the morning to get ready for the day. So we'd have staff. I had staff running from 5:30 in the morning to get a start on the day in Newfoundland from Ottawa. And then I'd get there about 7. We'd run through what the arrangements were going to be for Mr. Harper's day to make sure that everything was ready, and then get him briefed at 8:30. If Parliament was sitting, of course, he'd be in question period many days of the week while Parliament was sitting, usually Monday to Thursday. If he was traveling, I ordinarily didn't travel with him. I'd be in Ottawa to make sure that we were providing everything he needed while he was traveling. The end of the day would come, he'd leave at about 5:30 or 5:45 to go home, because he liked to have dinner with his kids. He had young kids, obviously. And I'd keep working after that to make sure we're ready for the next day until about 9 o'clock, and I'd leave the office at about 9 o'clock at night. So as I say, in those 2.5 years I was in the Prime Minister's office, it was the best 20 working years of my life, since you do feel like you put in about 20 years in 2.5. But it was a fantastic experience, and I was very, very, very lucky to be able to do it. But yeah, it was a long, crushing week. The weekends were busy as well. Mr. Harper was very, very attentive to the details of government. Every time there's a new Prime Minister, the civil service wants to know how much does he want to be involved in what's going on. And as he stayed in office, I think the briefing notes from the government got longer, more detailed. He wanted to know the details of what was going on. He wanted to be kept abreast of a lot of what was going on inside the government and around the country. And of course, everything that goes up to him also landed on my desk, and so that put a premium on time to keep ahead of his work. And to get all the work that I had to get done was an enormous load, but it was fun. It was a fantastic job, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
So the beautiful thing I think about Prime Minister Harper was that he was a conservative prime minister, and he truly had conservative values. So I assume for a chief of staff, he's going to want someone that's on the same wavelength as him. How does he get to the point in meeting with you or having dinner with you or chats with you where he finds out that you are also of a true conservative political persuasion?
I'd written some speeches for him early on in my time in Ottawa. You know, I mean, I didn't know all of his political views at that point, so you're sort of taking a bit of a stab in the dark when you start with a blank piece of paper. Can you write a speech about this topic for me? And I think, you know, writing speeches for political leaders is difficult because you want to get their voice, but you also want to get their views. I think that helped. But I have to say the big piece was, I go back to writing the platform for the 2006 election. I mean, it's a big effort. So I chaired a team that wrote that platform. I didn't literally write it all myself. But he told me when I went back to be his chief of staff in opposition, he said, I want a short platform. I want one that's focused on the most essential pieces of government. I want one that's going to be any Canadian citizen could sit down and understand what it is that we're driving at. So we had the tax cut to the GST, a tightening up of the criminal code, criminal justice amendments, a plan to send daycare money directly to parents rather than having it spent through a government department, and a big anti-corruption legislation, the Accountability Act. I had a piece in each one of those. I mean, lots of people involved, but I understood that those were sort of the 4 or 5 big pieces that he really wanted to see in that platform. And working with him over the course of 4 or 5 months to draft that out, obviously, I didn't just sit down and write it myself. He has to sign off on that. And so you're back and forth. I think I developed an understanding of what he was trying to do. I think he developed an understanding of where I stood on most of these issues, and there was a lot of overlap there. Once we were in government, when you talk about being a conservative, the first thing is you have to be careful with taxpayers' money. We can't just splash. You know, the money doesn't grow on trees. That taxpayers' money has to be spent carefully. I think we tried to manage carefully inside his office to make sure that the money that was being spent on his travel and on his support of his day-to-day work was carefully spent. And that's an example that kind of spreads across the government. And I think that helped as well. We didn't have any big scandals about spending money on travel or spending money on the house or so forth while he was in office. And I think that sets the stage for everybody to learn from the example.
Historically speaking, it became a huge success and became a majority government. I want to go on to talk about that, but first we have to take a short break. Just hang on, viewers. We'll be right back with Prime Minister Harper's former Chief of Staff, Ian Brodie. Stay with us. All right, we're back now with Ian Brodie. Now, Ian, I wanted to talk about the early 2000s. And here's a book that kind of summed up the feeling at the time for conservatives. It was a time when it was thought that Liberals would be the natural governing party of Canada forever. And there was this feeling that, are the Conservatives ever going to be possibly back in power? And how do they accomplish that? How do they make that happen? That was a challenging time for Conservatives. Would you agree?
I would agree. And I would just say it was a preoccupation of mine. I mean, I'm not just a citizen and interested in politics, but a political scientist as well. And, you know, elections work best, democracy works best when there's strong competition between 2 parties or more than 2 parties. I mean, you have to have 2 parties that have a chance of winning the election for the whole system to work, right? You want every vote to count, and therefore you want to have a real contest between at least 2 parties that have a chance of winning. And from 1993 until 2004, we didn't really have that because, in a sense, we presented too many choices to Canadians. People had retreated to their corners on the conservative side, and there was a long period of division, of working out people's views on how the Morley government had turned out and how the Clark government had turned out. I don't want to go back to all of that because it's ancient history now, but I think certainly by 2003, by the time I got to Ottawa, there was a strong sense that the sort of the free ride had to come to an end. Later that year, there was a book by a prominent Ottawa journalist about the huge majority government that Paul Martin was going to win in 2004. You know, he's going to win 250 out of 300 seats. It was going to be a victory to end all. There's going to be the epic victory of Canadian politics. And I have to say, having that rubbed in your face every day is a bit of a motivation as well, right, Dan? We were the underdogs, but I liked being the underdog, and I liked the idea that it was time, once the two parties had come together, once we had the single party, that it was time to show that Canadians had actually a choice in the 2004 and 2006 elections, and at that point, I think it was a matter of time before we got quite the right formula to make sure we could win.
Yeah, and I don't think it's any secret. I was involved in the party in the early 2000s, and I recall a policy convention in Montreal where hundreds and hundreds of grassroots conservatives came together from all across Canada to have input into what direction, where was the party headed and where should it go. And I remember, you know, sitting for that 2 or 3 days there where people took the microphone and everyone had their chance to say. I think it was just such a beautiful thing that it was a grassroots movement. And I give credit to you and Mr. Harper for allowing the grassroots to have so much input into where the party should go. And I think it really put it on a huge, strong footing for the future.
Well, on that particular, on the convention in Montreal, I mean, I was executive director of the party when we picked Montreal as the location for that convention. And then for all the preparations for that convention, we had a strong convention committee and hundreds of volunteers involved in it, and a pile of staff. But I remember at the time when we had to make a decision where, you know, we wanted to have the convention in March of 2005. There aren't too many places in the country that can hold a meeting that big. Should we have it in Montreal? That was a big debate because, you know, Montreal hadn't been a very happy ground for conservatives for a very long time. The party was new. We expected there'd be all sorts of internal pressures and internal stresses. Did we want to air everybody's views live on national television in the middle of Montreal? Was that the best way to put our best foot forward for an election campaign in the future? And I think the risk that we took of having it in Montreal, having it all live on television, having it basically open to almost all of it was open to the public, paid off enormously because, as you say, hundreds of members, almost 2,500 members of the party came from coast to coast, and it presented, I think, serious people trying to deal with a serious other vision of the future of the country on the floor of that convention came off well. And that was the point at which everybody looked around and said, oh yeah, we can run a properly run professional national political party that's competitive in an election campaign.
Yeah, it really was an empowering thing. It seems that politics now has become so much top heavy and downward pressure on, and the grassroots almost silenced in what goes on day to day. But I'm curious about your most memorable times as chief of staff. Can you share a few of those with us? We're curious to hear about it.
On the somber side, if I start with a somber note, because of course the entire time I was in government, we were involved in the war in Afghanistan, and we had at any one time about 2,500 troops on the ground in Afghanistan, in a very difficult, in really many ways the hardest part of Afghanistan was the Canadian part of Afghanistan. We hadn't picked that mission, but we'd inherited it and decided to extend it. The political part of that mission was tricky. Trying to keep Parliament on side was very difficult. Trying to keep a focus on the importance of that mission was difficult. But I have to say, I saw every day Mr. Harper would get energy and focus on the seriousness of the job from what was going on the ground in Afghanistan. He called, with one or two exceptions, the next of kin of everybody who was killed during that mission. Difficult days in the office, but you get a certain moral strength from confronting the price of service that people pay in the armed forces. And so, although those were difficult days, there were also days of great strength. I remember, getting the second point of the GST cut from 6% to 5%, which I think was a major accomplishment that let us go back to the public in an election campaign and say, when we promise to do something, you can trust us to do that. Not everybody liked the policy, and I understand that, but I think the idea we could establish that, when politicians say we're going to do this, there are some politicians who will do it. And then the very early days of the 2008 economic crisis, you really saw the best of people in government come together. I'd left the office by the time of the big crash in the fall of 2008, but you could start to see the beginning of the problems and how much people in government sort of turned their mind very quickly to what would happen if all hell broke loose in the economy. And I think we were, as a result of that, very well prepared after I left government to weather that storm. And really, Canada, difficult economic time for lots of people, of course, but on the whole, I think wide acknowledgement that Canada turned out a better effort during that economic crisis than most other countries in the world.
Yeah, lower taxes, and they reduced, you guys were able to reduce the debt significantly, which seems to be a foreign concept these days. And on that note, as Bob Dylan said, the times they are a-changing.
Yes.
And there's an interesting, relatively new book by Stephen Harper, right here, right now. I've been reading it. He describes it almost as a manual for conservatives in an age of disruption. I just want to read a quick quote from that book about the conservative message and whether it's still relevant today. And he says, "Why is the conservative message important? Because I believe conservatives are uniquely positioned to advance an agenda that makes markets and globalization work better for everyone. Our respect for social institutions, including the nation state, community, faith, and family, is a big reason why this is so. But it is also because of conservatism's focus on practical matters rooted in real world experience. It's about seeing the world as it is rather than how we wish it to be." That sums it up in a nutshell if we were to distinguish liberals and conservatives. It's the practical everyday things and seeing the world as it is and how people are, human nature. That's the beauty, I think, of the conservative message. Do you think there's a future for conservatives in Canada?
Look, on that front, Dan, I'm very optimistic about that, to be blunt. Since 2015, since Mr. Trudeau was elected, I don't want to be unduly partisan here, but his is a government that's focused on almost a fantastical view of the future of Canada, the future of the West. He's got Build Back Better ideas and ideas of equity, and these are all fine ideas. But in the meantime of pursuing all of these very sort of cloudy ideas, inflation's out of control. The cost of living is really hurting people where they live. The cost of housing is a major impediment for people who are in their late 30s and early 40s. These are not kids anymore. These are people who've sort of mid-career professionals who find it hard in many cities to be able to buy a suitable house. And Pierre Poilievre, when he was running for leadership of the party, I think was laser focused on these, as Mr. Harper would have said, practical issues that require a practical view of reality. When you're in government, you have to be paying attention to these sorts of things. You can't always be focused on what the clouds look like. You have to be focused on what life is like here in Canada and here on planet Earth. And I think Canadians are looking for governments and for political leaders. You can see this in the provincial elections recently, who are focused on more practical issues, because after 6 or 7 years of head in the sky, it turns out that life down here on Earth is not quite as good as it was 7 years ago. Not quite as solid. People are not quite as sure about the future. We have difficult wars going on and threats overseas, and really serious economic problems here. There are opportunities we have as Canada, as Canadians, that we've given up for some environmental reasons or some issues of social justice or whatever. But in the end, the economy has to grow and people have to have jobs for the country to be a success. Jobs and economic growth help families, help communities build communities, help local neighborhoods take care of their problems. And And I think over the next, let's say, year and a half or 2 years to the next election, we're going to have, I think already Mr. Poilievre has brought the federal Liberals back to earth, focused on more practical issues like cost of living and housing. And I think that's a good corrective to a more head in the sky debate we've had over the last 7 years.
Okay, there's young people who are thinking about politics, getting involved, maybe following in your footsteps, Ian. Do you have a final short message of inspiration for those young people, that there's a role for them in the Canadian political scene?
Yeah, I teach at a university, so obviously I'm surrounded by people in their late teens and early 20s. We see all sorts of mental health challenges and anxiety on this campus and on every campus across the country. And I think some of that comes from a sense of hopelessness about problems that seem they're too big to be resolved. We're focused on climate and environmental issues or social justice issues that are really global problems. You say, well, how am I, as a 20-year-old student here, or a 20-year-old getting started in the workforce, how am I supposed to have an impact on that? The good thing about being involved in politics is you focus on problems that are solvable in the community, right? City councils focused on things that are a challenge in London. London has challenges that need to be met by the municipal government, and there's lots of solutions, lots of people of goodwill. Once you get into politics, you find out that most of the people who are involved are not cynical schemers. They're there because they're trying to make their community better. They're trying to make the province better. They're trying to make the country better.
Ian, we're running out of time. I've got to let you go, but
Great.
Look, keep up the good fight. Thanks for being with us today and sharing this interesting story.
Good to see you, Dan.
Take care.
Thanks, Mike.